Hi, this is Pilleater. I'd like to discuss a very important topic. What is queerness? So, what is queer? Queer is an adjective that means strange or odd. She had a queer feeling that they were being watched. It's also in British informal slightly ill. But the most popular definition refers to a homosexual person. That is, denoting or relating to a sexual or gender identity that does not correspond to established ideals of sexuality and gender, especially heterosexual norms. Queer geek culture has featured gay themes since the 1980s. Nightclubs have traditionally been a space where queer people, trans women in particular, can explore gender with relative safety. It's also a verb, spoil or ruin, an agreement, event, or situation. Reg didn't want someone meddling and queering the deal at the last minute. More importantly, we should be talking about the origin, and the origin is early 16th century, considered to be from German queer, oblique, perverse, but the origin is doubtful. Usage. The word queer was first used to mean homosexual in the late 19th century, when used by heterosexual people. It was originally an aggressively derogatory term. By the late 1980s, however, some gay people began to deliberately use the word queer in place of gay or homosexual, in an attempt, by using the word positively, to deprave it of its negative power. Queer also came to have broader connotations relating not only to homosexuality, but to any sexual orientation or gender identity not corresponding to heterosexual norms. The neutral use of queer is now well established and widely used, especially as an adjective or modifier, and exists alongside the derogatory usage. Furthermore, we have queer theory. And queer theory is a field of critical theory that emerged in the early 1990s out of the field of queer studies and women's studies. Queer theory includes both a queer reading of texts and theorization of queerness itself. That's interesting how one word which was insultive or derogatory became a whole sphere of influence in critical theory. At the bottom paragraph, it writes, queer theory also examines the discourse of homosexuality developed in the last century in order to place the queer onto historical construct, deconstructing contemporary arguments both for and against this latest terminology. Whether you're for or against deconstruction, the point is that a term used to describe someone outside the normative has become its own discipline, and we have to ask ourselves, what is queer? Now, this is a Wikipedia article that tries to make sense of it through cross-dressing, intersectional bodies, gender ambiguity. It just means anybody who is strange and outside the norm. But this has also invented queer literature and film. One of the most important texts of queer literature has been Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs, where there's also a chapter, Uncle Rumpus's Room, where a boy is being raped by an alien Munkins, and he's being lynched and he's shitting. Very explicit and transgressive art, but well loved by the elite establishment. There is also Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where a journalist is doing drugs and observing from a gonzo point of view, a first-person view, about Las Vegas in this kind of Holden Caulfield way. The work of Jim Goad is heavily influenced by Hunter S. Thompson's views. Also, the book has many cartoons by Ralph Steadman in there, bringing this edginess. It's not just literature, it's also the art that is more popular. And then there is Howl by Allen Ginsberg. And Howl is a work of poetry about, going against normative values of Morlock and about being ass raped in gay sex. And this, punk rock bum mentality. That too is about this freedom. At the bottom, there are 4 films, and these films were nominated, or not just nominated, but also rewarded the Best Picture of the Year by the Oscars. First, we have Moonlight of last year, about a black man who is gay or queer, and about how extraordinary interesting his life is. Why would that win the Oscar of the year? We also have The Shape of Water, about a woman who falls in love with a fish monster. It is outside normative man and woman, but the woman is falling for something outside her human race species, something that is queer in itself. Romance can be anything, love is anything, right? But the two films on the right, particular Birdman, why would I list Birdman as queer? Well, Birdman was a movie or a parody of all these famous movie actors joined together, and it parodies the movie industry in itself, and only someone in that industry could understand what is going on. That is the queer condition, or other queers for queers. So it's not about, highlighting this queer identity and this outsideness of sexuality, but about people interested in unique, eccentric individuals. And Birdman seems to compile that, in a film in itself. And then there's the artist. Now you may be saying, what's the artist have anything to do with queerness? The artist sounds very conservative. Well, the artist is a nostalgic trip, this kind of idealized vaporwave that is paying tribute to black and white films 100 years ago, ironically in 2014-15. And the irony is that we can make better films without black and white, but why was the artist even elected? Well, it's because the old queers, the established queers, are nostalgic about past film. And only someone with a good eye about fine art and cinema could only understand the artist as a tribute and pretty much way of understanding the film industry, and only a type of interesting artist could make art of the past. Which again is ironic, just as Forrest Gump, another film that worships the boomers generation. But with this media listed, we can understand why queers act the way they do, or that the current reoccurring theme is living an eccentric and exotic life, whether that is through sexuality or not. Queer can mean many things about the artist. Queers are the outsider artist, the artist that society has shunned and in return the queer hates. The queer wishes to change the metapolitics of society in order for it to become more tolerant of his views, or see it destroyed under his nihilism. Yukio Mishima, Michel Foucault, and Colin Wilson all discuss the conditions of the queer man. The thesis of their lives was around their queerness. Yukio Mishima wrote Confessions of a Mask, about growing up being gay and into sadomasochism and having revenge fantasies. Michel Foucault wrote about the history of sexuality and about rules, why why someone outside normative society can't be in normative society. And Colin Wilson, with his book The Outsider, about how outsiders, queers, influence the metapolitical discourse and change realities. Is there a queer elite? Since the 1960s, the boomers have aged enough to take over positions of power that the modernists, or their parents, once had, and so they changed everything for their own liking. Few traditions were passed down. The alt-right and anti-liberalism is a movement of keeping moral traditions alive, mainly by the millennial generation. So a queer individual hates society and is a misanthrope, although he might be sympathetic creating his own society. And that brings up the white nationalist concept of an ethno-state. Do queers just want a queer ethno-state, or just be along with other queers? Well, the art world is ruled by queers. Rapper Fat Joe once said that the rap game is run by the gay mafia. And he is right, to a certain Pizzagate degree. The artist understands the queer, not the normie. All original art is created by new perspectives and realities. These break our limits of understanding the world. We need to acknowledge outsiders as the real innovators. However, this has created a capitalist supply and demand within the art world, and now is inflated with too much queerness. To get ahead, one has to be non-cis, or just not a normie. The easiest way is saying, "I'm gay, and I really mean it." Preening and pretentiousness is the center of proving oneself as more authentic than the other, the new keeping up with the Jones. Because only queers contribute original art, it is a race, a progressive stack, to write one's his place in history. Every silly claims like, all geniuses are mentally ill, is a form of this queer competition. Just don't fall for it. And we have art by Paul McCarthy, which is an inflated butt plug out in London, and Serrano's Piss Christ, which tries to pay tribute to Christianity, but it's covered in his piss in this punk rock tradition. Forget about Thomas Kinkade, because even though Kinkade would pass as the real and authentic fine artist, following a tradition of the masters, his art is shunned because it is normative, it's cis. By having normies in power, you downplay all future art created. No original voices of the outsider can be expressed. This is the fear of Nazi Germany. As we can look in Kinkade's painting, it's a church out in a whimsical forest, right? Definitely queers hate that. That brings up values, and Kinkade's art will just influence other artists in that position of power. So where do queers come from? Well, queers come from many places. Queers may come from abusive family upbringings, places outside NYC or California, or sometimes in NYC and California if they meet up. They come from punk rock music or a music scene. It can come from bourgeois elitism, or Melvins becoming self-actualized. Incels are a type of queers. Or the artist who wants to do new things, and so he becomes queer. All places around the world that relate to Western culture, or postmodernism, is this form of queerness as well. That's where anybody can come from. Also, people having too many hobbies that become a part of their habitual life routines. If you do one thing over and over again, people will consider you that queer as well. And you might also be asking, what you've previously saw on the previous slides, why is sexuality such a huge part of queerness? Do you have to sexualize everything? No, you don't. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. Non-sexual queers, for example, are Review Bra and Wesley Willis. Maybe Christian Weston Chandler to some degree as well. Sexuality became a part of queerness because the gay community contributed the most original art, and it was assumed someone who had a different sexuality created cutting-edge art, or had a non-normative experience. Gay originally meant happy you get a lot more sex than the conservative normie Chad. You were gay, you were happy, you got a lot of sex, right? You didn't have to be married. But queer, it meant something strange about him. Could be anything. That guy's a little queer, If you weren't with the boys or the girls, you must have been a queer and you were shunned for it. Completely natural reaction, why it became a derogatory term. Richard Simmons is a perfect example of the queer. We don't know if he's really gay or not. We just assume it. Whether by his accent or his eccentric personality, I would think Simmons is a queer. Do people hate queers? Yes, they do. Encyclopedia Dramatica is a troll website that documents queers and exposes their condition. Mr. Metacore is a YouTuber that has made a living documenting queers on the internet. Now, queers don't mean to create hostility. They just exist. Some queers, like Michael Isaacson, is hostile in nature, but that is who he is. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the nature. People hate queers because they are the outsiders. Mr. Metacore is just trying to make the internet safe by pointing out who's in and out of society. Who are these queers? But again, it's natural for people to hate them. But can queers become successful? Yes, they can. They are everyone from Jamie Stewart of Juju to XXXTentacion. Rest in peace. Realize talking about queers is a touching subject. Normies want to norm, and there is no reason for society as a whole to tolerate queerness. It is why we now have blue-haired SJWs, where this is normies trying to play the queer game. They're trying too hard. They just want friends. Queerness is an education. Not everyone should be queer. I am totally against concepts like the Chad queer or Stacy queer. And I believe queerness happens naturally, usually from an abusive upbringing. In other words, Eminem and Machine Gun Kelly are Chad queers to some extent. Yet rap is considered normative. There isn't much cutting edge avant gardeness to the character. That is, unless they support left wing causes, thus building upon a queer resume. For example, Luke Ford goes to pornography to the alt right in a single lifetime. How can Luke Ford be some Adolf Hitler neo-Nazi if he was invested in pornography? As for Eminem and Machine Gun Kelly, white rappers is a very rare thing. And that has some queerness to extent, but their culture is Chad. But only then, when they build upon other things, like doing this or doing that, will build upon this fringe queer identity. And thus maybe creating more success with the character. Should I self-identify as a queer? Some people do, but the people who are queer are labeled by others as queer. Proud queers wear it as a badge of honor, for better or for worse. For example, John Waters. People call him queer, and sometimes he says he's queer, but he likes to put himself as an average guy into the transgressive arts. The queer may not like labels, but this is the ultimate judgment for being non-normative. Expect to be called a queer if you do queer things. If I call a certain individual queer and doesn't agree with the term, well, you shouldn't have been doing the queer thing in the first place. Queerdom happens everywhere. Is the alt-right queer? Well, it's becoming a queer scene if it becomes full of mentally unstable people. It's easier to call the audience queers for queer's sake, that if queers meet up with this type of hobby, expect the entire hobby to be considered queer. So, what's so normative about wanting race war now, save the white race? Now, this is anti-Jared Taylor, who is not a queer. Jared Taylor is a white racial advocate and conservative of American Renaissance. Queers who are in the alt-right are much more like, they might be mad at this realization that you would consider some lunatic a queer, but it becomes evident when things become white nationalism 1.0, or aka Hollywood Nazism, like a gay skinhead like Nick Crane, right? It goes beyond their Nazi or hateful ideology and into the queer condition. And so if people are more attracted to the alt-right because it's transgressive and punk rock, you have the right to call them queer. And so this is very interesting. The people who think they are doing good are being called queer. And again, this is something very important that needs to be discussed. You have to understand that queerness is important. We understand the condition of the artist and the individual who creates art through queerness. The cosmopolitan globalist elite is obsessed with queerness, and we should learn it in order to understand their desires. Personally, we desire a character in life experiences that wish was ours through queer people. When queer people do it, we wish they did what they did, So we get a perspective on life that we haven't experienced by watching the queer arts, whatever that may be. We are exposed to new art forms and interesting people through queerdom. The new artist and art scene is queer, or both individual and scene-wise. And the queer creates a market, making other people jealous over their queerness. The picture on the right, for example, is from She-Ra and the Princess of Power by Noelle Stevenson, who advocates SJWism and bisexuality. These two characters are a perfect example of this queerness and people's jealousy of wanting to be these characters. And this is a big problem. So, a bigger problem on its own that I will further discuss in my pamphlet, Queer Culture, A Transgressive Tradition, An Introduction for Normies and the Misguided Artist, will soon be released in 2019. I am currently in the works of it. But this should just be an introduction about what is queerness. It's not just sexuality. It's more of an eccentric personality, an eccentric artist that creates the world, and how our postmodern globalists are now obsessed with it. We need to understand this because it is now trickling down on the internet, whether you consider yourself far right, far left, especially far left, or just a normal person. The misguided artists like Thomas Kinkade cannot succeed unless he understands concepts of queer culture. That is how you succeed in today's market as an artist. Thanks for listening. www.pilleater.com